It began in the final quiet moments of a somber church service, long after the cameras had turned away and the royal procession had disappeared behind ancient stone walls. According to whispers now spreading through palace circles, a senior royal chaplain revealed that Queen Elizabeth's final private remarks about Sophie were not directed toward titles, status, or protocol, but toward trust. And the expression Sophie reportedly carried as she stepped out into the cold Windsor air told insiders something extraordinary had just happened. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The atmosphere inside the chapel that day had already been heavy with unspoken fear. Senior royals sat quietly beneath centuries of tradition, but behind the stillness, tensions had already begun tightening around the future of the monarchy. The Queen's health had become impossible to ignore, and every glance exchanged between family members carried the weight of uncertainty. Yet according to those now speaking in hushed confidence, something changed entirely during the final moments after the service ended, when most of the congregation had already begun to disperse. That was when the Queen reportedly asked for Sophie to remain behind. Not a secretary, not a senior advisor. Sophie. For years, Sophie had quietly occupied a strange position within the institution, respected, dependable, yet often underestimated by those obsessed with hierarchy and public attention. She was never the loudest royal, never the one demanding headlines. But palace insiders had long noticed something others overlooked. Whenever crises erupted behind closed doors, Sophie was often the figure the Queen relied upon to steady the emotional collapse unfolding beneath the crown. And in those final private moments inside the chapel, it appears the Queen may have acknowledged that loyalty more openly than ever before. The chaplain's alleged recollection has only deepened the mystery. Sources claim the Queen spoke with unusual emotional honesty, something even long-time aides rarely witnessed. One insider described the exchange as deeply personal, almost urgent, with the monarch reportedly reflecting not on public duty, but on endurance, on who could still be trusted to preserve stability once the family entered what she feared would become a dangerous new chapter. Palace staff who later learned fragments of the conversation were reportedly stunned, not because the Queen praised Sophie, but because of how directly she did it. For a monarch known for restraint, the remarks carried extraordinary weight. When Sophie finally emerged from the chapel beside Edward, witnesses immediately sensed the shift in her demeanour. She appeared composed on the surface, but her expression reportedly revealed someone carrying the emotional burden of words too significant to repeat publicly. Edward stayed unusually close to her during the departure, his protective silence only fueling speculation among aides already whispering about what had transpired inside. Several senior royals were said to have looked unsettled after hearing fragments of the private exchange, particularly because the Queen's remarks seemed to imply something larger than affection. It sounded, according to one insider, like the passing of quiet responsibility. And perhaps that is why the revelation has surfaced only now. For years, the palace carefully protected the image of unity, while fractures deepened beneath the surface. But as tensions surrounding the monarchy continue growing more visible, the memory of that final church service has returned with renewed force, because if the Queen truly singled out Sophie in those final private moments, then it raises a question the palace may never fully escape. What exactly did the Queen see coming before the rest of the family did? And why did she believe Sophie would be one of the few capable of surviving it? But the deeper truth surrounding that final church service was not simply about grief. It was about the Queen quietly identifying who she believed could still protect the crown when everything else began to fracture. For years, the final private church service attended by the late Queen remained buried beneath layers of royal silence, protected by tradition and guarded by those closest to Windsor. Yet according to various interpretations now emerging from former staff and clergy insiders, something unusual unfolded inside that chapel. The atmosphere reportedly shifted the moment Sophie entered the Queen's line of sight, as though an unspoken understanding passed between them in complete silence. Those present would later describe the gathering as deeply restrained, almost unnervingly quiet. It was not a grand public occasion filled with ceremonial spectacle. It was smaller than that, more intimate, more fragile. Only a carefully controlled circle of senior royals and trusted clergy had reportedly been permitted inside the private chapel near Windsor, a decision that immediately fueled speculation among palace staff. Even within royal circles, access that day was said to have been unusually restricted. Conversations were lowered to whispers, movements were measured, and beneath the solemn prayers and formal traditions, there lingered a growing awareness that the monarchy itself was standing on the edge of irreversible change. The Queen, according to those quietly reflecting on the service years later, appeared physically diminished but mentally unwavering. Her body may have shown signs of exhaustion, but her mind reportedly remained intensely alert, watching every interaction around her with startling precision. One former aide allegedly recalled that the Queen spoke very little during the early moments of the gathering, preferring instead to observe the emotional currents moving silently between family members. And it was during those moments that something subtle but significant reportedly became impossible to ignore. Whenever Sophie approached, the Queen's tension appeared to soften. Her expression calmed. The strain seemed to ease, if only briefly. Staff members noticed it immediately. So did the clergy standing nearby. For Sophie, the situation carried an emotional weight few outside palace walls could fully understand. For decades, she had remained one of the monarchy's most dependable yet overlooked figures, carrying out duties without demanding attention, absorbing pressure without public complaint. While louder personalities often dominated headlines, Sophie had quietly earned something far more valuable within the institution itself: trust. And according to insiders now revisiting that final service, the Queen's attention towards Sophie that day did not resemble casual affection. It resembled recognition. A recognition shaped by years of loyalty, silence, and endurance through some of the monarchy's darkest internal storms. Edward reportedly remained close throughout the service, observing carefully while maintaining his usual reserved composure. Yet insiders claim even he appeared aware that something emotionally charged was unfolding between his wife and the Queen. Other senior royals, meanwhile, were said to have remained more distant, bound by protocol, but disconnected from the deeply personal exchange quietly developing within the chapel. That distance did not go unnoticed. In fact, several palace staff members later suggested the emotional contrast inside the room felt impossible to ignore. The Queen's focus kept returning to Sophie, again and again, as though she was measuring something far beyond the present moment. Whispers surrounding the conversation itself have only intensified with time. Some reports suggest the Queen spoke privately about duty, resilience, and the terrifying uncertainty surrounding the Crown's future stability. Others claim the discussion carried undertones of warning, particularly regarding the fractures already beginning to spread through the royal family behind closed doors. One chaplain would later hint that the Queen's primary concern during those final months was future continuity, a phrase that has since sparked enormous speculation among royal insiders. Because continuity did not simply mean survival. It meant identifying who could still hold the institution together once emotional loyalties began collapsing under pressure. And while the service itself appeared solemn and traditional from the outside, insiders now believe the Queen may have been preparing Sophie for a responsibility no one expected to be spoken aloud that day. The revelation that shook palace insiders was not dramatic shouting or a royal confrontation. It was something far more dangerous inside the House of Windsor: quiet trust. Reports suggest the Queen spoke of Sophie not as a secondary figure within the monarchy, but as someone who understood the burden of duty without needing applause. And within royal circles, that kind of praise carried enormous meaning. Inside the monarchy, attention has always been both a weapon and a currency. Some fought desperately to control headlines. Others measured influence through public admiration, strategic appearances, and carefully managed visibility. But Queen Elizabeth, particularly during the final years of her reign, had reportedly grown increasingly skeptical of noise. Age and loss had changed her perspective. After decades of scandal, betrayal, and internal fractures, insiders claim the Queen no longer searched for charisma when evaluating the people around her. She searched for endurance, stability, silence under pressure. And according to multiple former aides, Sophie quietly embodied all three. What made the situation so striking was Sophie's consistent refusal to chase recognition. While public fascination often drifted toward more controversial royal figures, Sophie continued carrying out responsibilities with little demand for praise or spectacle. Palace insiders allegedly found this deeply significant because it mirrored qualities the Queen had spent her entire life respecting. One former staff member reportedly described Sophie as steady during chaos, someone capable of calming emotional storms inside palace walls without ever appearing desperate to be seen doing it. In an institution constantly battling ego, ambition, and fragile public perception, that kind of restraint became increasingly rare. Whispers comparing Sophie to the late Queen Mother only intensified those conversations. Not because their personalities were identical, but because both women allegedly understood the emotional mechanics of monarchy in ways others often failed to grasp. They knew how to absorb pressure without publicly collapsing beneath it. They understood that survival inside the royal institution was not about winning every battle loudly, it was about protecting continuity quietly, even while suffering privately. According to insiders, the Queen deeply valued that similarity, and as her health declined, those qualities reportedly became more important to her than ever before. The death of Prince Philip appears to have marked a turning point in that growing trust. His absence left behind more than grief. It created emotional instability within the royal structure itself. The Queen, already burdened by physical exhaustion and escalating family tensions, reportedly leaned more heavily on the small number of people she believed could still provide emotional steadiness. Sophie's role during that period allegedly expanded significantly behind closed doors. Royal aides later hinted that her presence often reduced tension during sensitive family discussions, particularly when emotions threatened to spiral into resentment or division. Some even claimed Sophie became one of the few people capable of speaking honestly, without triggering defensiveness inside increasingly strained royal relationships. That quiet influence, however, may also explain why frustration reportedly began growing within certain palace circles. Several insiders allegedly felt Sophie remained dramatically underestimated by both the public and sections of the institution itself. While louder royal figures consumed media attention, Sophie's growing importance remained largely hidden from public view. Yet within the palace, those paying close attention had already begun noticing the shift. The Queen's confidence in Sophie no longer appeared occasional or symbolic. It appeared deeply personal, intentional, almost protective. The royal chaplain's later comments only fueled that perception further. Though careful with language, the chaplain reportedly implied the Queen's words about Sophie carried deep personal certainty, a phrase that sent shockwaves through those familiar with the monarch's famously guarded nature. Queen Elizabeth was not known for emotional exaggeration. She measured trust carefully, often over decades, which is precisely why these alleged remarks now carry such explosive weight within royal conversations. Because if the Queen truly viewed Sophie as one of the monarchy's emotional anchors during its most fragile period, then the implications extend far beyond simple affection or gratitude. But if the Queen's confidence in Sophie was genuine, then the obvious question became impossible to ignore: who inside the monarchy might have felt threatened by that growing trust. As whispers about the Queen's final remarks spread through aristocratic circles, reports suggest old palace tensions quietly resurfaced behind closed doors. Because within the monarchy, influence is rarely announced publicly, it moves silently through access, trust, and proximity to the sovereign. And according to insiders, Sophie's rising standing during the Queen's final years reportedly unsettled more than a few powerful figures. By that stage in the monarchy's history, the institution was already struggling beneath enormous internal strain. Public confidence had become fragile. Family fractures had grown impossible to fully conceal. Every appearance, every statement, every carefully staged moment carried the pressure of protecting a centuries-old system that many feared was slowly losing its emotional foundation. Yet while headlines focused on controversy and spectacle, something quieter was happening inside palace walls. The Queen, according to multiple reports, had reportedly begun relying more heavily on a small inner circle, built not around status, but around reliability. And within that circle, Sophie's position appeared to be growing stronger with each passing year. Former aides allegedly described Edward and Sophie as increasingly essential during private engagements, particularly as the Queen's physical condition declined. They were said to arrive without unnecessary drama, without demands, without the exhausting emotional calculations that often accompanied royal dynamics. That mattered deeply to the Queen in her later years. After decades of navigating ambition, rivalry, and carefully managed public personas, insiders claim she had developed little patience for theatrical behavior disguised as duty. What she valued instead was steadiness, presence, the ability to protect the institution quietly while others competed loudly for relevance. And that, according to palace staff, was exactly why Sophie's growing influence became impossible to ignore. Several aides allegedly referred to her as part of the stabilizing circle, a phrase that carried enormous significance within royal operations. It meant more than companionship. It suggested trust at the highest emotional level of the monarchy itself. Sophie reportedly became someone capable of easing tension during difficult family discussions, particularly during periods when public scandals and private resentments threatened to overwhelm the institution. Her influence was not built through intimidation or political maneuvering. It was built through consistency, through years of showing up when others retreated behind distance, ego, or silence. But inside royal households, rising trust often creates silent discomfort. According to insiders, certain powerful figures reportedly viewed Sophie's expanding role with caution, not necessarily because they disliked her personally, but because proximity to the sovereign always carries institutional consequences. The monarchy operates through invisible hierarchies as much as public titles, and access to the Queen during her final years reportedly became one of the most sensitive forms of influence inside the palace. Every private conversation mattered. Every emotional bond carried implications. And if Sophie truly held the Queen's confidence in ways others did not, then the balance of power inside royal circles may have been quietly shifting long before the public realized it. The contrast between working royals and publicity-driven figures reportedly became another growing source of tension. Palace insiders claim the Queen increasingly admired those willing to endure responsibility without demanding constant validation in return. Sophie's approach reportedly reflected that philosophy perfectly. She did not dominate interviews. She did not appear obsessed with controlling public narratives. Instead, she focused on continuity, duty, and emotional discipline, qualities the Queen allegedly believed the monarchy desperately needed during its most uncertain modern chapter. That difference became even more noticeable as other members of the family found themselves consumed by public battles, media conflicts, and reputational crises that continuously destabilized the institution from within. Then came the Chaplain's revelation, and suddenly conversations that had remained buried for years erupted back into royal discourse. Because the suggestion that the Queen privately expressed deep confidence in Sophie did more than revive emotional memories. It reignited a much larger debate about the monarchy's future direction. Was the Queen quietly signaling what kind of figures she believed should guide the institution forward? Was she warning against the dangers of spectacle overpowering service, or had she simply recognized, in Sophie, a rare form of loyalty that had become dangerously scarce within the modern royal machine? And as those tensions quietly intensified behind palace walls, the true meaning of the Queen's final words about Sophie began to feel less sentimental and far more strategic. The timing of the Chaplain's revelation has become almost as controversial as the revelation itself. Why now? Why allow whispers about the Queen's private thoughts to surface during one of the monarchy's most fragile modern periods? According to palace observers, the answer may lie in the growing battle between visibility and duty, a conflict that has increasingly defined the modern royal era. For years, the monarchy survived by carefully balancing tradition with public emotion. But in recent times, that balance has started to fracture beneath relentless pressure. Public trust became harder to maintain, internal divisions became more visible, and behind palace walls, according to insiders, there was growing fear that the institution was drifting dangerously toward performance instead of purpose. That fear reportedly haunted the Queen during her final years. She had witnessed the transformation of royalty from a system built on restraint into one increasingly consumed by media cycles, public battles, and personality-driven attention. And those closest to her claim she understood exactly how fragile the crown could become if duty was replaced by spectacle. That is why many palace commentators believe the chaplain's remarks were never truly accidental. The timing feels too precise, too loaded with meaning. As conversations surrounding the monarchy's future intensify, the sudden emergence of the Queen's deeply personal trust in Sophie appears, to some observers, almost like a message resurfacing from the past. Not a public statement, not an official declaration, something quieter, more strategic. A reminder of what the late Queen valued most when the institution itself felt increasingly unstable. In that context, Sophie's growing public image becomes impossible to separate from the larger royal story now unfolding. During periods of scandal, tension, and uncertainty, Sophie reportedly remained one of the few senior royals who consistently projected calm without appearing calculated. She did not compete for attention. She did not feed public drama. Instead, she quietly continued carrying out responsibilities while larger personalities dominated headlines for all the wrong reasons. And slowly, almost unexpectedly, public appreciation for quieter working royals began growing stronger. People exhausted by royal conflict reportedly started gravitating toward figures who embodied steadiness instead of spectacle. Sophie became central to that shift. Insiders also claim Edward and Sophie strengthened their relationship with William and Catherine during this period, particularly as pressure surrounding the future monarchy intensified. According to palace observers, a deeper alignment quietly formed between royals, focused on preserving institutional stability rather than personal publicity. That growing closeness only fueled speculation surrounding the Queen's alleged remarks, because if Sophie truly represented the values the Queen believed necessary for survival, then her role within the royal structure may have become far more important than the public ever realized. Several commentators have even described Sophie as the unexpected anchor of the monarchy's transitional era, not because she sought influence openly, but because she reportedly earned trust in moments when the institution desperately needed emotional steadiness. That distinction matters. Inside royal life, influence often grows strongest through silence rather than visibility, through reliability rather than ambition. And according to those who observed the Queen closely during her final chapter, Sophie increasingly became associated with continuity itself, the ability to keep the monarchy emotionally grounded, while public storms raged outside palace gates. Yet beneath these conversations lies a far darker and more unsettling possibility. Some insiders now wonder whether the Queen foresaw fractures within the institution long before they became visible to the world. Perhaps her alleged comments about Sophie were not simply expressions of affection or gratitude. Perhaps they reflected concern. Concern that the monarchy was approaching a period where loyalty, restraint, and quiet duty would become essential for survival. If that interpretation is true, then the chaplain's revelation transforms from emotional recollection into something far more explosive, a warning hidden within the Queen's final private reflections. And the deeper these whispers spread through royal circles, the harder it became to ignore the haunting question at the center of it all. Was the Queen merely praising Sophie's character, or was she quietly identifying the kind of royal she believed the institution would desperately need once the coming fractures finally tore into the open? But the most emotional part of the story was still hidden within the final moments of that church service, moments that those present reportedly have never forgotten. According to those familiar with the atmosphere inside the chapel that day, the moment that truly haunted witnesses was not spoken aloud at all. It was reportedly the final glance exchanged between the Queen and Sophie before the congregation quietly began to leave. A look described by insiders not as ceremonial, but deeply personal, as though the Queen understood time was running out, and Sophie understood exactly what was being silently entrusted to her. Those who later reflected on that final service struggled to describe the emotional weight hanging over the room. It was not panic, not chaos, something quieter and far more unsettling. Witnesses reportedly sensed that everyone present understood they were standing inside the closing chapter of an era that had shaped Britain for generations. Yet amid the grief and uncertainty, one detail continued resurfacing in private conversations among palace staff and clergy alike: Sophie's extraordinary composure. While others reportedly appeared emotionally overwhelmed by the Queen's visible frailty, Sophie remained calm, steady, almost protective in her demeanour. That contrast did not go unnoticed. In fact, several insiders would later suggest it was precisely during moments of emotional collapse that Sophie seemed to become strongest. The Queen's final interactions during that service are now being re-examined through an entirely different lens. At the time, many assumed the exchanges were simply private moments shared between family members facing heartbreaking reality. But after the chaplain's later comments, every gesture suddenly appeared layered with deeper meaning. The Queen reportedly watched Sophie closely throughout the gathering, not with distant royal politeness, but with a level of emotional recognition rarely visible in public life. According to one insider, the atmosphere surrounding them carried the feeling of unfinished understanding, as though something profoundly important was being communicated without needing words at all. That silent understanding may explain why admiration for Sophie has intensified so dramatically among royal supporters in recent years. For decades, she remained one of the monarchy's quietest figures, operating far from the centre of media obsession. Yet the further the institution drifted into turbulence, the more Sophie's loyalty appeared to stand out. Palace insiders repeatedly described her trust as something earned slowly over years of consistency, particularly during moments when the royal family itself seemed emotionally fractured. She did not demand attention during crises. She absorbed pressure. She steadied it. And according to those who observed the Queen closely, that emotional reliability became priceless during the monarch's final years. Edward's role beside Sophie also began attracting new attention after the revelations surfaced. Together, they increasingly came to represent something the monarchy appeared desperate to preserve: continuity without chaos. While public battles consumed other royal relationships, Edward and Sophie reportedly maintained a quieter form of stability that deeply reassured the Queen. Some palace commentators even argued that the late monarch saw in them echoes of an older royal philosophy, one built not on celebrity, but on endurance, discipline, and silent responsibility. In an institution constantly threatened by internal fractures, that steadiness may have become one of the Crown's last emotional anchors. Still, the most haunting mystery remains unanswered. What exactly was said privately that day? The chaplain's comments opened the door to speculation, but insiders insist far more may have unfolded inside the chapel than the public will ever fully know. Some believe the Queen spoke directly about the monarchy's uncertain future. Others suspect the conversation carried warnings about the emotional storms already beginning to form behind palace walls. And then there are those who quietly wonder whether the Queen, fully aware that time was slipping away, deliberately chose Sophie as someone she believed could help preserve the dignity of the institution when future divisions threatened to destabilize it completely. That possibility has forced the monarchy to confront one of its oldest and most painful realities. Survival has never depended solely on crowns, titles, or ceremony. It depends on trust, on the people willing to protect the institution when public admiration fades and internal rivalries intensify. And perhaps that is why the memory of that final glance continues haunting those who witnessed it. Because in that moment, according to insiders, the Queen did not appear focused on history behind her. She appeared focused on the fragile future waiting ahead. And in the silence that followed that final church service, one truth reportedly lingered above every royal title, every palace rivalry, and every whispered dispute. The Queen may already have known exactly who she trusted to protect the dignity of the crown when the storms finally arrived. What stunned royal observers most was not the chaplain's revelation itself, but the unusual silence that followed from Buckingham Palace. In a monarchy where even the smallest rumour is often quietly corrected through carefully planted briefings, the absence of denial reportedly spoke volumes. Palace insiders began whispering that officials were unwilling to challenge the emotional weight surrounding the Queen's alleged remarks about Sophie, especially given how deeply respected the late monarch remains across every royal household. That silence created an atmosphere far more powerful than any official statement could have. Royal commentators quickly noticed that the palace neither confirmed nor aggressively dismissed the growing speculation. And within royal culture, where silence is often as strategic as speech, many interpreted that restraint as deeply significant. The institution appeared to understand the danger of confronting a story tied so closely to the Queen's final private reflections. Because this was no longer just about Sophie, it was about the memory of Elizabeth herself, a monarch whose authority had been built over decades of sacrifice, discipline, and emotional endurance. Challenging the emotional truth behind those alleged remarks risked unsettling the fragile reverence still surrounding her legacy. Meanwhile, Sophie reportedly continued her royal duties without acknowledging the controversy publicly. No emotional interviews, no attempt to reshape the narrative. She simply carried on, maintaining the same disciplined composure that insiders claim first earned the Queen's admiration years earlier. Edward remained equally restrained, quietly protective and firmly loyal as speculation intensified around them. Together they projected something increasingly rare inside modern royal life: stability without performance. And according to younger palace aides, that quiet restraint became deeply admired behind the scenes, particularly among staff exhausted by years of public royal conflict. The comparisons between Sophie and the late Queen only grew louder, not because Sophie sought to imitate her, but because many began noticing similarities in temperament, the emotional control, the refusal to inflame tensions publicly, the instinct to prioritize duty over attention. Palace commentators argued that Sophie represented a fading royal philosophy rooted in endurance rather than visibility. In an era increasingly dominated by media battles and personal branding, that older model suddenly felt valuable again. Public sympathy also appeared to shift toward quieter working royals, especially figures who seemed committed to preserving stability instead of fueling spectacle. At the same time, deeper questions quietly emerged inside palace circles. Was the monarchy itself beginning to reshape its inner structure under the weight of recent turmoil? Were figures like Edward and Sophie becoming more important precisely because they represented continuity without chaos? According to insiders, those conversations intensified after the chaplain's remarks surfaced, because if the Queen truly trusted Sophie during her final chapter, then her judgment carried enormous symbolic weight for the institution's future. And perhaps that is why the story continues resonating so powerfully. In the end, the chaplain's revelation was never truly about a single sentence spoken during a final church service. It was about legacy, about trust, about which members of the royal family quietly endure when the glamour fades and the institution enters its darkest seasons. Reports suggest the Queen saw something in Sophie that could not be manufactured through headlines, titles, or public campaigns, a steadiness rooted in duty itself. And within the sacred machinery of the monarchy, that may have mattered more than anything else. Royal insiders now increasingly frame Sophie as part of what some privately call the old guard of duty. Figures who understand that survival inside the monarchy has never depended solely on public affection. It depends on emotional resilience during moments when the institution itself begins trembling beneath pressure. Edward and Sophie, through years of quiet service, reportedly became symbols of that resilience. And as fascination grows around the Queen's private judgments, many are left wondering what other conversations may still remain hidden behind palace walls, waiting for the right moment to surface. The monarchy continues evolving beneath the enormous shadow of Queen Elizabeth's legacy. But perhaps the most haunting part of this entire story is the possibility that the Queen understood exactly what storms were coming long before the rest of the world saw them. And if these reports are true, then her final trust in Sophie may not have been sentimental at all. It may have been deliberate. A quiet recognition of who she believed, still understood the painful truth at the heart of royal life, that the crown was never sustained by glamour, but by sacrifice carried silently through generations. And as the doors of that ancient chapel closed for the final time, insiders now believe the Queen may have left behind more than memories. She may have quietly revealed which royal she believed still understood that the crown was never about power, but about sacrifice. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.